Welcome. Let's jump right into the key global headlines for you today. We're covering quite a range, from diplomacy and conflict to humanitarian issues and legal matters.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's begin with Ukraine. The situation remains incredibly tense.
Yeah. Russia still controls a very significant portion of the country, almost 20% of Ukrainian territory.
And there's been renewed talk about potential peace deals, particularly some comments from Donald Trump.
Right. He recently suggested that most of the major points are agreed to. He's been pushing for high-level talks between Russia and Ukraine.
And part of his suggestion includes Russia keeping Crimea, which, they annexed back in 2014.
Exactly. Which is, well, a very different stance from Ukrainian President Zelensky.
Definitely. He's been adamant about needing real pressure on Russia to get an unconditional ceasefire.
Although he did seem to suggest later that territorial issues could potentially be discussed, but only after a complete ceasefire is in place.
It's a subtle shift, perhaps. Meanwhile, there are reports about a U.S. peace proposal. What's that about?
Well, the reports suggest it involves Ukraine potentially ceding quite large areas of annexed land.
Ceding land? Like what specifically?
It apparently includes American legal acceptance, essentially, of Russia's annexation of Crimea and de facto recognition of their control over other occupied areas, like Luhansk.
Wow, that sounds like a major concession. How does that compare to other proposals?
It's quite different. Reports indicate European and Ukrainian counterproposals would only even discuss occupied territory after a ceasefire. So ceasefire first, then talks.
And the U.S. plan? What about NATO?
That's another key point. It reportedly rules out Ukraine joining NATO.
And U.S. officials are still talking to Russia directly.
Yes, U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff was recently in Moscow for high-level talks with Putin. That's actually his fourth visit this year alone.
So diplomacy is happening, but Zelensky seems frustrated.
Very much so. He criticized Russia quite strongly for not agreeing to a proposed 30-day ceasefire. He's calling for more international pressure.
And he cited some specific concerns.
Yeah, allegations that Russia imported missiles from North Korea apparently containing U.S.-made parts and used them in that deadly strike on Kiev recently.
And the attacks on the ground continue, sadly.
Yes, drone attacks are ongoing. There was one recently in Pavlograd that killed 3 people.
Ukraine generally doesn't claim responsibility for attacks inside Russia or on specific figures, right?
Officially, no, but you hear unnamed sources linking Ukrainian intelligence to, well, assassinations of certain Russian military figures. It's murky.
And Russia's public stance on a deal.
Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said Moscow is ready to reach a deal with the U.S., but he added that some elements still need adjustment.
Interesting. And even Kyiv's mayor has hinted concessions might be needed.
He did suggest that territorial concessions might ultimately be necessary to achieve peace. So a lot of different signals out there.
Okay, let's shift focus now. There's a significant event coming up in Rome.
Right, the funeral of Pope Francis. It's expected to be one of the largest gatherings of world leaders since the Queen's funeral back in 2022.
Huge gathering. So does that mean potential for diplomacy?
Well, formal meetings are pretty unlikely, out of respect for the occasion. But these events often create opportunities for informal chats, sort of brush-by diplomacy.
And there's specific interest in a potential interaction.
Yes, particularly between Trump and Zelensky. Both are expected to attend. The question is whether they might use the chance to talk about a ceasefire in Ukraine.
Even if they're not formally meeting.
Exactly. Though, seating arrangements might place them far apart. Zelensky had initially said he was ready to meet Trump, but then more recently expressed doubts about even attending because of the strikes on Kyiv. So we'll see.
And Vatican City itself plays a role here.
It does. It's considered neutral territory. So leaders who might face European travel sanctions could potentially attend.
Though not necessarily Putin or Xi Jinping.
No, neither of them are expected to be there. But history has shown that sometimes unexpected diplomatic encounters can happen at these kinds of solemn international gatherings.
Okay, let's move to another critical situation, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Yes, it's incredibly dire. The World Food Program, the WFP, is issuing stark warnings. They're saying people are literally running out of ways to cope.
And any progress made during that brief ceasefire seems to have vanished?
Completely unraveled, according to the WFP. Fragile gains are gone. Food prices have just skyrocketed.
Skyrocketed. And basic goods.
Essential commodities are incredibly scarce. This is raising really serious concerns about nutrition, especially for, children, the elderly, vulnerable groups.
So what's the WFP calling for?
An urgent plea for borders to be opened for both aid and trade. They say they have over 116,000 tons of food assistance ready to go, just waiting for crossings to reopen.
116,000 tons, that's massive. And displacement is still a huge issue.
Huge. Over 80% of the population in Gaza is displaced. And since mid-March alone, another 400,000 people have been displaced again.
Just unimaginable disruption. How are people getting food?
Hot meal kitchens are absolutely essential, but even they are struggling. They're only reaching about half the population, and supplies are very limited.
So people are forced into desperate measures.
Absolutely. The WFP describes people eating less, sometimes just one meal a day, bartering whatever they have left, selling belongings, and there's been a noticeable increase in begging, just desperate coping mechanisms.
And Israel's response to criticism about the blockade.
The Israeli Foreign Ministry has rejected the criticism.
Just to provide context, this all stems from the initial Hamas attack on Israel and then the subsequent Israeli military response.
That's right. And the death toll in Gaza, according to the Hamas-run health ministry there, is tragically very high.
And there are longer-term health concerns too, right? Beyond immediate hunger.
Yes, concerns about asbestos contamination and all the rubble from destroyed buildings. That poses a significant long-term health risk for people living there.
A truly devastating situation. Okay, let's turn to a major legal case in the U.S.
Right, the trial of Luigi Mangione. He's the man accused of killing the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson.
And what's the latest there?
He's pleaded not guilty to the federal charges, which include murder and stalking.
Federal charges. And prosecutors are seeking.
They're seeking the death penalty. Their argument is that the killing wasn't just murder, but was intended to amplify an ideological message against the healthcare system.
A death penalty case? When might the trial happen?
It looks like it could be a while. There's apparently a huge amount of evidence to review, so the federal trial likely won't even start until maybe 2026.
That's a long time. And there are complications with state charges, too.
Yes, the defense wants the federal trial to happen before any state charges are dealt with. And they've also accused state prosecutors of eavesdropping on privileged phone calls between Mangione and his lawyers.
So procedural battles alongside the main case. This case seemed to tap into some public sentiment, didn't it?
It really did. Thompson's killing sparked a lot of reaction online, reflecting, widespread frustration with privatized healthcare in the U.S. Quite significant amounts of money were actually raised from Mangione's defense fund.
And there was physical evidence pointing to a motive.
Yes, shell casings found at the scene reportedly had specific words etched onto them, interpreted as direct criticism of healthcare companies.
Okay, one final story for today, also from the U.S. legal system, but involving a judge this time.
That's right. A Wisconsin judge, Hannah Dugan, has been arrested.
Arrested? On what charges?
Federal charges of obstruction of justice and also concealing a person from arrest, specifically helping someone avoid arrest by immigration agents.
How did this allegedly happen?
It started with IC agents arriving at her courtroom with an arrest warrant for a Mexican national who was present for an unrelated matter.
And how did the judge react?
Reports say Judge Dugan reacted quite strongly to the agent's presence in her courtroom. The charges allege she then took actions to actively help the individual get out of the courthouse and evade capture by the ICE agents waiting outside.
So, direct intervention alleged. What are officials saying?
The FBI director commented on the arrest, emphasizing the need to follow the law. Judge Dugan's lawyer, meanwhile, is strongly protesting the arrest, calling it an overreach.
I imagine the reaction is divided.
Very much so, and largely along partisan lines. Democrats tend to criticize the arrest as an attack on judicial independence and the courtroom sanctuary. Republicans are emphasizing that everyone, including judges, needs to cooperate with federal law enforcement.
Has something like this happened before?
There was a somewhat similar case a few years back involving a state judge in Massachusetts also facing obstruction charges related to immigration enforcement in a courthouse. So it's not entirely unprecedented, but still highly unusual.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our roundup for today. Quite a mix of complex situations.
Absolutely. From the ongoing war in Ukraine and the potential diplomatic ripples at a funeral to the dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza and these really complex legal cases in the U.S.
It certainly highlights the interconnectedness, but also the distinct pressures people and institutions are facing globally.
Yeah, you see how individual actions, whether it's a world leader, a judge, or someone caught in a crisis, they all contribute to these larger narratives playing out.
Definitely gives you something to think about how all these different threads, from conflict zones to courtrooms, weave together to form the bigger picture we see unfolding.